Hey there. Welcome to LSAT Demon Daily. I'm Ben Olson. That's Nathan Fox. Together, we're the founders of LSATdemon.com and our weekly podcast, Thinking LSAT. We have an email here from Quentin.
It's a very thoughtful email from Quentin. It's a follow-up to our discussion that we had on an episode a week or two ago about, remember, Ben, when the Egyptian guy was asking about whether he should check the box for African American? And we naively said, well, Egypt is in Africa and you identify, you're not white, and Egypt is in Africa and you're an American now. So why not African American? Sure. I think the reason why we said, the reason why that was our answer was because I think the schools necessarily have to defer to the applicant on a lot of these issues. What is your identity?
Yep.
And also because lawyers are driven by facts. And if a lawyer can, if you can say, Egypt is in Africa, I'm Black living in America, you asked me my ethnicity and I said African American. Like, it's a very
literal
simple
definition.
Right. And so, but the thing, I guess I want to point out that there is a difference between and there's a difference between truth and justice. Right. Okay. Or there's a difference between defensible facts and what would actually be just or fair.
Or what the underlying goal is.
The goal of the policy. And
the spirit of the law and the letter of the law.
You have to recognize that we're not really looking at the spirit of the law. We're looking at the letter of the law. Like what would be a defensible position for someone to take?
Which is kind of the definition of the legal profession, but yeah, okay.
Well, that's what you'll learn, unfortunately, when you go to law school. You're going to realize how amoral this entire thing is. I mean, it's just it's not about right and wrong. It's about what are we allowed to do. And anyway, Quentin has a much more nuanced and resourced take on this whole thing. And so I'm going to read Quentin's email top to bottom because this is a much more thorough treatment of this topic. Okay. My name is Quentin, and I've been listening to the Demon Daily podcast for several months. In the recent episode titled, Am I African American? I felt like the ethnic designation of African American and what it means was misrepresented and misunderstood by both of you, so I want to provide some clarity. African American is an ethnic group that exclusively encompasses individuals who descend from U.S. chattel slavery. It has nothing to do with racialized features such as dark skin or kinky hair. It does have to do with country of origin to the extent that one can trace their ancestry back to U.S. chattel slavery. So I'm not endorsing this view, by the way. This is all news to me. Quentin seems to know what he's talking about, but I don't know what the authority is for any of those assertions, right? Like, wait, you have to be able to track yourself back to U.S. chattel slavery in order to be an African American? I'm not saying you're wrong. I just don't know why you're right. I believe you. It seems like you're earnest. But why, I guess. Second paragraph. Currently, there is a growing identity debate in Black America. Before 1965, Black people of foreign birth residing in the United States were nearly invisible. According to the 1960 census, their percentage of the population was to the right of the decimal point. That, however, is no longer the case. At the beginning of this year, the Pew Research Center found that Black immigrants and their U.S.-born children account for 21% of the overall Black population. Though Black immigrants and African Americans are all a part of the Black race, our lineal experiences are worlds apart. What does lineal mean? Like having something to do with lineage? Yeah.
I'm assuming lineage, yeah.
Define lineal. It's an adjective in a direct line of descent or ancestry. Okay. So, yeah, okay, I get it. You obviously have different ancestors. The most glaring and perhaps consequential difference is that nearly all Black immigrants migrated to a post-civil rights America when overt discrimination had decreased and opportunities were expanding for women and minorities. African Americans, on the other hand, were here pre-civil rights and are still dealing with the legacies of slavery and the Jim Crow era when they were effectively locked out of making political and economic gains. In fact, the sustained multi-generational plunder of African Americans has resulted in an egregious black-white wealth gap. Not sharing this pre-1965 history that African Americans experienced made it possible for some groups of Black immigrants to achieve greater social and economic status than African Americans. African Americans as defined by Quentin. And of course, we totally get it, right? Like Egypt, well, there's a lot of money in some places in Egypt. And if you weren't being discriminated against for being Black in Egypt, your ancestors, that is, then I can certainly see why your Black experience as an Egyptian immigrant to the United States could be dramatically different from somebody whose, great grandparents were slaves, obviously. So we can see why there's a debate, right, Ben? One of the measures being advocated for in the midst of America's changing Black demographic is the disaggregation of Blackness. Proponents argue that lumping all people of African descent together does more harm than good. Take, for example, college admissions, particularly to elite universities. According to some accounts, over 40% of Black students who attend Ivy League institutions are Black immigrants or the children of Black immigrants. Aside from masking the failure of African American students to rise to the top levels of America's educational system, using African American as a catch-all is also unfair. Black immigrants are self-selected based on factors such as educational attainment and wealth. Thus, when Black immigrants arrive in the US, they have certain advantages at the aggregate level over African Americans and sometimes white Americans. For example, in 2019, 64% of Black Nigerian immigrants residing in the US had at least a bachelor's degree, compared to an estimated 22% of African Americans and 36% of non-Hispanic white Americans. In Nigeria, however, only 7% of the population had earned a bachelor's degree. Making African Americans compete with people who are, in many cases, the elite of their respective countries of origin based on similarities in phenotype misses a lot of crucial nuances, like the fact that at his 1964 commencement speech at Howard University, President Lyndon B. Johnson was very clear about who affirmative action was intended to help. And there's links throughout this. I can't really convey that very well in a podcast, but there's links to many of these. That's pretty striking, huh? Like 7% of Nigerians have a bachelor's, but 64% of Black Nigerian immigrants to the US have bachelors.
Yeah, it's a surprising fact to learn, but once you learn it, it makes some sense.
Yeah.
People who are leaving their country of origin are people who have access to means, education, whatever.
Although counter argument, you got people like walking to the United States from Guatemala. They're not doing that because they have riches and opportunities. They're doing that because they have the exact opposite of riches and opportunities.
True. But in
so,
general, I would say when people have means, they also have mobility, right?
Yes.
In a way that if you don't have means, it's going to be harder to move or even know your options, right?
Yes. But there are plenty of displaced people, refugees who have nothing and are it's because they are displaced. That's why they're mobile. Like they don't have anywhere else to be. So it's got to be some of both, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Quentin continues, while I don't have a lot of knowledge about how race and ethnicity work in Egypt, I do know that first-generation Black immigrants, especially those from Africa and the Caribbean, don't know that they are Black until they come to the United States. In fact, last week, my coworker, who is a Ugandan immigrant with dark brown skin, told me during lunch that there is no need to refer to oneself as Black in Uganda. Even when they do understand the various racial categories in the US, African and Caribbean immigrants do not identify with Black or African American. Instead, they check the, quote, some other race box and write in their respective ethnicity or nation of origin, which is what I would have told the anonymous listener from Egypt to do. I hope my response was illuminating, or at the very least, you now understand that being African American is vastly different from being an African in America. If you have questions, comments, or are curious about anything I've written, feel free to email me. Thanks, Quentin. Thank you, Quentin. That was definitely illuminating. Obviously, I don't think there's an easy answer to this question.
No, it's a very, challenging race itself is it's a complex mix of all sorts of cross currents. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, next time somebody asks me this question, I'm just going to forward them Quentin's email. But I don't think I would go straight to, oh, you have to check some other race and write in your exact nation of origin, because I think I'm still going to go back to, well, it's up to you. Like, what do you identify as?
Yeah.
All this identity stuff. I don't know. I'm a dumb white guy. I don't really have, I'm not the guy who's supposed to have answers to any of this stuff. So I don't know. I kind of think it's going to have to come back to, like, how do you feel about checking that box? If they were to ask you about checking that box, what would you say? And I don't know. I fully willing to grant that might be wildly unfair in some cases, but it ain't fair. Like, none of this is fair. Anyway, really appreciate your email, Quentin. Thank you for the clarification on that. Email daily@lsatdemon.com if you'd like to ask us a question or share some LSAT or law school admissions news. Thanks for listening.